About 3 centuries BC, numerous hordes of Gauls crossed the Alps and penetrated to the center of Etruria, which is nowadays Tuscany. The Etruscans, being then at war with Rome, proposed to take them, armed and equipped as they had come, into their own pay. "If you want our hands," answered the Gauls, "against your enemies the Romans, here they are, at your service, but on one condition. Give us lands." A century afterwards, other Gallic hordes descending in like manner upon Italy, had commenced building houses and tilling fields along the Adriatic, on the territory where afterwards was Aquileia. The Roman Senate decreed that their settlements should be opposed, and that they should be summoned to give up their implements and even their arms. Not being in a position to resist, the Gauls sent representatives to Rome. They, being introduced into the Senate, said, "The multitude of people in Gaul, the want of lands, and necessity forced us to cross the Alps to seek a home. We saw plains uncultivated and uninhabited. We settled there without doing anyone harm. We ask nothing but lands. We will live peacefully on them under the laws of the Republic." Again, a century later or thereabouts, some Gallic Kymrians, mingled with Teutons or Germans, said also to the Roman Senate, "Give us a little land as pay, and do what you please with our hands and weapons." Want of room and means of subsistence have, in fact, been the principal causes which have at all times thrust barbarous people, and especially the Gauls, out of their fatherland. An immense extent of country is required for indolent hordes who live chiefly upon the produce of the chase and of their flocks, and when there is no longer enough of forest or pasturage for the families that become too numerous, there is a swarm from the hive and a search for livelihood elsewhere. The Gauls emigrated in every direction, to find, as they said, rivers and lands. They marched from north to south and from east to west. They crossed at one time the Rhine, at another the Alps, at another the Pyrenees. More than 15 centuries BC, they had already thrown themselves into Spain, after many fights, no doubt, with the Iberians, established between the Pyrenees and the Garonne. They penetrated northwestwards to the northern point of the peninsula, into the province which received from them and still bears the name of Galicia. South-eastwards to the southern point between the river Anas, nowadays Guadiana, and the ocean, where they founded a little Celtica, and centerwards and southwards from Castile to Andalusia, where the amalgamation of two races brought about the creation of a new people that found a place in history as Celtiberians. And 12 centuries after those events, about 220 BC, we find the Gallic peoplet, which had planted itself in the south of Portugal, energetically defending its independence against the neighboring Carthaginian colonies. Indortius, their chief, conquered and taken prisoner, was beaten with rods and hung upon the cross. In the sight of his army, after having had his eyes put out by command of Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general. But a Gallic slave took care to avenge him by assassinating, some years after, at a hunting party, Hasdrubal, son-in-law of Hamilcar, who had succeeded to the command. The slave was put to the torture, but indomitable in his hatred, he died insulting the Africans. A little after the Gallic invasion of Spain, and by reason perhaps of that very movement, in the first half of the 14th century BC, another vast horde of Gauls, who called themselves Ambrons, that is, braves, crossed the Alps, occupied northern Italy, descended even to the brink of the Tiber, and conferred the name of Ambria or Umbria on the country where they founded their dominion. If ancient accounts might be trusted, this dominion was glorious and flourishing, for Umbria numbered, they say, 358 towns, but falsehood, according to the Eastern proverb, lurks by the cradle of nations. At a much later epoch, in the 2nd century BC, 15 towns of Liguria contained altogether, as we learn from Livy, but 20,000 souls. It is plain, then, what must really have been, even admitting their existence, the 358 towns of Umbria. However, at the end of 2 or 3 centuries, this Gaelic colony succumbed beneath the superior power of the Etruscans, another set of invaders from Eastern Europe, perhaps from the north of Greece, who founded in Italy a mighty empire. The Umbrians or Ambrons were driven out or subjugated. Nevertheless, some of their peoplets, preserving their name and manners, remained in the mountains of Upper Italy, where they were to be subsequently discovered by fresh and more celebrated Gaelic invasions. Those just spoken of are of such antiquity. Those just spoken of are of such antiquity and obscurity that we note their place in history without being able to say how they came to fill it. It is only with the 6th century before our era that we light upon the really historical expeditions of the Gauls away from Gaul, those in fact of which we may follow the course and estimate the effects. Towards the year 587 BC, almost at the very moment when the Phocians had just founded Marseille, 2 great Gaelic hordes got in motion at the same time and crossed, one the Rhine, the other the Alps, making one for Germany, the other for Italy. The former followed the course of the Danube and settled in Illyria, on the right bank of the river. It is too much, perhaps, to say that they settled. The greater part of them continued wandering and fighting, sometimes amalgamating with the peoplets they encountered, sometimes chasing them and exterminating them, whilst themselves were incessantly pushed forward by fresh bands coming also from Gaul, thus marching and spreading, leaving here and there on their route, along the rivers and in the valleys of the Alps, tribes that remained and founded peoples. The Gauls had arrived towards the year 340 BC, at the confines of Macedonia, at the time when Alexander, the son of Philip, who was already famous, was advancing to the same point to restrain the ravages of the neighboring tribes, perhaps of the Gauls themselves. From curiosity, or a desire to make terms with Alexander, certain Gauls betook themselves to his camp. He treated them well, made them sit at his table, took pleasure in exhibiting his magnificence before them, and in the midst of his carouse made his interpreter ask them what they were most afraid of. "We fear not," they answered, "unless it be the fall of heaven, but we set above everything the friendship of a man like thee. The Celts are proud," said Alexander to his Macedonians, and he promised them his friendship. On the death of Alexander, the Gauls, as mercenaries, entered in Europe and Asia the service of the kings who had been his generals. Ever greedy, fierce, and passionate, they were almost equally dangerous as auxiliaries and as neighbors. Antigonus, king of Macedonia, was to pay the band he had enrolled a gold piece a head. They brought their wives and children with them, and at the end of the campaign they claimed to pay for their following as well as for themselves. "We were promised," said they, "a gold piece a head for each Gaul, and these are also Gauls." Before long, they tired of fighting the battles of another. Their power accumulated. Fresh hordes in great numbers arrived amongst them about the year 281 BC. They had before them Thrace, Macedonia, Thessaly, Greece, rich, but distracted and weakened by civil strife. They effected an entrance at several points devastating, plundering, loading their cars with booty, and dividing their prisoners into two parts. One offered in sacrifice to their gods, the others strung up to trees and abandoned to the gaze and matars, or javelins and pikes, of the conquerors.